here so that we can so welcome today to office hours. The nature of this time is for you to bring conversations to the table. I already had a bit of a conversation this morning with Andy, who's in the UK also, and has some great questions to ask. But I think just to help facilitate there, if you can bring up your chat thing on the side there, if you have something that you want to bring up, I'll try and bring people in via the questions that you post in the meeting chat. Is that a problem for anyone? Do you all know how to do that? And everyone said, amen, hallelujah. Okay, so the nature is that it's an open floor here, and anything related to Torrance or the field of Torrance studies, which could go into Polanyi or Karl Barth or any of the other Torrance brothers or sons, grandchildren. There are so many. Jim, I know that you've got possibly some Eastern Orthodox kind of questions. So anyway, who would like to begin with bringing something to the table? Go for it, Bill. You have to unmute there.
Recently, as in today, on the Trinitarian Theology Forum, a quote was posted attributed to Athanasius. The quote reads, "Flesh was taken up by the Logos to liberate all humans and resurrect all of them from the dead and ransom all of them from sin." I looked at that and I said, wow, that's a nifty quote. Where is that found in Athanasius? And I just started poking around on Google and came up with a very similar quote in the Schaff translation of the letter, I think it's letter 60 to what is it? Alpheus. You familiar with that?
That's the early church fathers series, the multi-volume set. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, it seems that that's the context of this quote. It's an exhilarating quote, I think. And I looked around, it said, from the letter to Delphius, seeing then that flesh was taken, and it's translated by Schaff, flesh was taken by the word to deliver all men, raise all from the dead, and make redemption for sins. And must not they appear ungrateful in view of this, those that don't agree with it, and be worthy of all hatred and make light of the flesh, as well as those who account of it charge the Son of Man with being a thing created or man? And that's as far as I went with the quote, but apparently is in the context of the madness of the heretics, right?
Maybe all humanity. We all have somewhat of an ungrateful.
I wanted to know, was that a quote, an actual quote from another translator? Because I like the way that it's worded. Flesh was taken up by the Logos to liberate all humans. Are you familiar with the work of a woman by the name, a patristic scholar by the name of Ramelli?
I'm not.
She is Italian. Illyria Ramelli.
Okay.
She wrote, among other things, Volume 1. Well, the title is A Larger Hope. Volume 1, Universal Salvation from Christian Beginnings to Julian of Norwich. Interesting book. You would believe that you might find that on Al Chemo's website,
Right.
Electic Orthodoxy.
Yeah.
And she says this, quote, Athanasius often displays universalistic overtones. Quote, flesh was taken up by the Logos to liberate all humans and resurrect all of them from the dead and ransom all of them from sin. Letter to Adelphius, PG, what's that? The
Page.
Greek. Athanasius declares here that all humans will be liberated from sin, unquote. So Athanasius put it in the context of speaking against the heretics, and she uses it as that quote as ammo for the greater hope
Right.
of universalism. I found that was very interesting. I just, you're not familiar with her, though. You're not.
I'm not. Patristics aren't my strongest suit. I'm wondering if Jim has any. He I think may have a deeper reading of the church fathers and even Athanasius than I do. Everything I know of Athanasius, I mostly know through reading T.F. Torrance. So
Yeah.
The work I've done in Zazulus, he deals more with the Cappadocians than he does with Athanasius. So to say, when I say Athanasius, I'm reading through a lens, which again, your question of interpretation, translations are interpretations. And so to say that Athanasius said something and that it's quoted is to recognize both that you do have English translators of an originally Greek text, and then you have context by people who have particular things that they want to see or hear in it. To ask, is there hope in the work of Athanasius? Absolutely.
Yes.
The question of what are the claims that we're making, the word wasn't used universalism there. I mean, it was a slightly different form of the word. It was
Universalistic.
universalistic. Yeah. So when we use these different endings, there is sometimes a bit of the nuancing that is attempting to say, we must believe there is hope because of the work of the person of Christ and the death and resurrection, and that it is intended for all humanity. And so we may speak to one another and to those who are heretics and for those who do not know that there is hope for them that is not grounded in them, but in fact in God. I think there are things we can say with confidence. When somebody wants to make something an ism and it becomes an absolute, when you place God within absolute constraints, Torrance is always going to say, I think we need to let God be God and we will be human. But we do have reason, every hope to believe that the goodness of the God revealed in the person of Christ gives us confidence to truly be gospel people who speak in good news kinds of ways.
Al Kimmel recently published a book about universalism.
Yes, I have asked him to come on and read a chapter out of his book. He has a chapter that deals with J.B. Torrance. And he's nervous about coming on. I'm not sure if he's afraid that I will disagree with him or that we'll disagree with him or what. But I said, we want to hear your voice. Please come on. We don't have to agree with each other, but to create a space where we listen to each other is important. So if you can encourage him to come on for a conversation, I would enjoy doing that. Our point here is not to agree as much as it is to listen well and to learn what it is that the people we look at are saying, and also the way in our contemporary context people are understanding Trinitarian theology, not as separate from the world, but engaged with it. And I think Al really wants to engage theology in contemporary conversations and questions. So bring it on, I say.
He's an Orthodox priest, yes?
Is he?
I think
I know
so.
he's a priest. I'm not sure if he's Orthodox.
I think
I'm
he's
not sure what
very
his.
much Orthodox, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know him? Is it Jim Brown? J.R. Brown?
That's Jim. Yep.
Do you know, are you familiar with Al Kimmel?
Al Kimmel.
No, I'm not sure. I've heard of him. Who is he? Is he American or
Yes.
American Orthodox? Yeah.
Yes, he is. I don't have his webpage up quite yet, but
Kimmel, did you say?
Kimel.
Kimmel.
Al-
I'll look him up.
Interesting first name. I'm sorry.
I'll look him up. I don't think I've ever heard of him before.
Well, he today on his page has an interesting quote from David Bentley Hart, who's
Oh, yeah.
also a Universalist, I believe.
Yeah.
Marty.
He is. Yeah.
Something like to desire the good is to know it. If one doesn't desire it, he doesn't know the good. Therefore, he cannot choose the good, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
If he doesn't know the good, he cannot choose the good. Goodness in the context of God's goodness, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, the idea, I guess, is all men, all humankind to know the good, that God will ensure they know the good.
Mm-hmm.
And once they know the good, they
I've
will
just
desire.
posted in the chat a link to his website, Eclectic Orthodoxy. So you could explore a bit there. He's certainly not a traditional kind of, I mean, the word eclectic is certainly as appropriate for him as the word
Eclectic. Yes,
orthodoxy.
eclectic.
Yes.
I first looked at that and I said, electric orthodox. I said, electric.
Yes.
I know some Orthodox who are Universalists and some who are not. So
Yeah.
I mean,
David Bentley Hart has certainly.
my position is I don't know. I really don't know.
Yeah. Which I think is T.F. Torrance's position as well.
Well, he has a hope, though. He's a hopeful, isn't he?
Well,
would you say that?
To say hopeful is to say that we have every reason. I mean, this was Karl Barth as well. We have every reason to hope that the God who has given all in His Son is the one who will embrace all ultimately in ways that we cannot conceive. But hope is not to make claims for God. It's that whole statement. Does a theologian make claims for God that one cannot absolutely substantiate? So to say, does God love all of humanity? I have no problem saying, yes, the God revealed the person of Jesus Christ loves all of humanity. In the first Adam, all died. Much greater is the gift in the second Adam, in whom all are made alive. I mean, for God so loved the world. I mean, we could just go on and quote verse after verse that would indicate that the nature of who God is. God demonstrates His love for us, and that while we're yet sinners, Christ dies for us. There is so much to say that we can with confidence say God loves everyone. But the question of what we mean by salvation, which I find a lot of people have not thought enough about what we mean by salvation. They're thinking saved from hell or something else that I think our theology has to be much deeper and richer and bigger than merely do I get a get out of hell card. So what do we mean by salvation? There are some people who are quote unquote committed Christians who live a kind of hell that I would not want to live in. And they make it hell for their neighbors and other people in the church. And it's like, there is something about what it means to be, saved from our own tragic ways of thinking and being that sometimes to say, who did Jesus have the most contention with? It was not quote unquote sinners, it was the religious people. And I think today, many of the contentions we have that people need to be released from are the imprisoned minds of a form of spirituality that keeps people focused on themselves, their performance. Am I getting my thoughts right? And all that. And they live tragic lives from which being saved would be an appropriate kind of discussion.
Rescue.
Yes.
Thank you.
You bet. So Andy, did you want to pick up with some of your thoughts on Jeff McSwain's Movement of Grace.
Yes, but just to change it a little bit to Jeff McSwain's other book, Simul Sanctification, if people know that one. Right, that one, yeah. Yeah.
And then you're reading right now in this one, Movement of Grace.
Movements of Grace, yeah.
Movements of Grace, Jeff McSwain, with a foreword by Jeremy Bigby.
So, but relating it to Barth's idea that Barth says, I am not the man I once was and still am, and I am not the man I will be and already am. Now, for that, I can see that for myself, I see it as when Jesus rose from the dead, he created a new humanity, right? That's when we became righteous. And Jeff McSwain, if I've read him rightly, and I might not have done, he's saying, I think he's saying that all our every person's being derives from the person of Jesus, derivatively. So the Christian is at the same time, he calls it Eustace humanity and peccator humanity, totally righteous and totally sinful. And I can see that for the Christian. Yeah, we are righteous, seated with Christ in the heavens, but we're also totally sinful. But as I read Jeff McSwain, he relates that to all of humanity. So even the non-Christian who derives his being from the person of Christ is also a Eustace, and so justified or righteous and sinful at the same time. So my question for that is, if it happened for the Christian that we were created anew when Christ rose from the dead, and our old man died, the old false self died, when has it happened for the non-Christian? Because in one part, Jeff is saying that Eustace humanity means every human being's union and communion with Christ and ongoing participation in him. So does that, how does that figure?
So if we bring in a little bit of the language of agency, so Jesus acting as an agent, he is an agent who takes on, he's elected not only to salvation, he's elected to damnation. So the death on the cross of Jesus is Jesus being the one who takes on our sinful humanity. He is elected to be the one who is, in a sense, damned on our behalf. And he is also the one who is elected to be the one in whom we as he is risen, so we rise in him. So to say, if we go to looking at the person of who Jesus is and how he establishes a sense of the stance of humanity from the agency of God, God has both called us out to be those who are completely sinful and therefore worthy of death, and has stood in our place in the person of Jesus. And we still are those for whom Jesus has died. We have not stopped being those for whom Jesus has died. We are still those who, and this is the sinful aspect of humanity, we still have that inclination. I was just working in a section of Bart where he talks about the fear complex of humanity that needs to build barriers against God for fear that he will take from us our freedom to be who we are. And this is my summary, and this is the root of sin. So this sense in the human that we still feel that we cannot trust God, that is the root of fear in us, which perfect love would cast out. But for many people, they have a perfect fear that casts out the love of God. And Bart does recognize that many in the church, and he even would say theologians, evangelical and Catholic, live with this fear that needs to build barriers against God and occasionally peers over the barricades. And so we have this fear in us that still would be, in essence, part of the sinful aspect that has not come to trust the God who in his agency has already loved us and who would say to us, you are my beloved child, not only to those who have responded to it, but even to those who haven't responded, that in hearing, for you I have come, for you I have died, that in responding to the love of God, their being would come to be aligned with or to acknowledge the one who has already come to us. So has Jesus come to every person in his death and resurrection and said, for you I have died? And I think that we would say with Torrance and Bart, as well as biblically, yes, he would say that. We should have no hesitation to say to anyone in any state of life who practices any religion that not because they practice religion, but in spite of the fact that they practice any religion, that the God revealed in the person of Jesus Christ has said, for you I have died. And that would be a recognition that there is something of the unknowingness, the hiddenness of God and the blindness of the human, that the speaking of the goodness of God toward them would be, and Bart and Torrance both use language of awakening, of blind eyes coming to see. There's a variety of metaphors that are biblical metaphors of a transformation that happens. And this question of the moment that you speak of, this is a moment where we come to align our reality with the nature of who God is. And this is where Torrance's kataphusin, that we do our scientific work in theology according to the nature of the one who we study. The kataphusin is where our thinking is aligned with the nature of a reality in such a way that we can think anew. And I think something as simple as when we grow up, it appears that the sun rises and sets, and so it's natural to think, as the world did at one point, that the sun must move around the earth. But there came a point where the nature of reality changed our minds, metanoia, a change of our minds, and we recognize, no, the sun is the center, and we, in fact, are the ones who are moving. And so at that moment where we recognize what is reality, there is a moment, and most of us don't remember the teacher or the parent who corrected our perception to be a more adequate apperception of what the bigger picture is. And ever since then, even though it looks like the sun rises and sets, we know there is a greater reality. The moment of coming to that thought isn't as critical as the reality that we have now been realigned. Does our perception still lead us to look out and go, oh, the sun is setting? Yes, the perception may be there, but the reality is also there within that. So we can have, and again, the word you use, the duality of our experience can fool us for a moment to think, oh yes, it's just the sun, or it's just me making choices for God or not for God. But to say the deeper reality is that in every moment that we are making those choices, that God has already made those choices for us, to be for us. And those in a sense are the moment by moment, what Bart is calling the accompanying of God in God's providence. That God does not dominate us, he does not abandon us, he accompanies us, and his loving will for us, as we awaken to it, the nature of our what he will call ethics responds to it. And when the love of Christ comes to us, guess what? We are transformed by that love and we act in different ways because of that. But it's an awakening to something that was already there. Is
Yeah.
that helping at all?
I can see and agree with that. It's just, but I think Jeff McSwain, it says that there are two determinations or two dimensions for the human being. For the Christian, the two determinations: the true self in Christ, the false self. I think he's also saying it for the non-Christian as well. Now, I can see for true self, is created when Christ rises from the dead. We are, but I think Jeff is saying that the non-Christian has a true self as well, and a false self. That's what I didn't get.
Yeah. Well, the nature of true self. So to say, is it truer to say to, and we'll just talk about Jane. Jane has never been a Christian, has not grown up in a Christian home. We are just talking to her for the first time and saying, do you know Jesus? No, I've never heard of him. You say, well, he is God who has come and loved you. It's like, well, I have no idea about this. In my mind, can I say, here is Jane, who all her life has been beloved of God. Her true self, in fact, has been unknown to her. She is ignorant of the one who has loved her, who's known her. She has operated, in a sense, with a false self, thinking that she is by herself, for herself, and that she must make her way in the world. And that what I'm trying to do is, in a sense, to awaken her to her true self. That is the one established by God. Does that make sense?
Yeah, living in contradiction to
Yeah, I
herself.
would say, yes, sin is the great contradiction of living as though we were something other than what we truly are.
Yeah.
So I think that is the sense that I would have, and I'd have to go and look at the particular sections you're looking at, but the sense of what we might mean by true self and who, I mean, this is always a question I'm asking. So who is it that gets to be the judge of this? I had a counseling appointment this morning, and there were questions of I'm working with a husband, and so the wife says you're hard-hearted, and it's like, so is everybody saying you're hard-hearted, or is it just her? Well, it's just her. It's like, well, then that's her opinion, but we don't want to make her the judge of who you are. But it is her opinion and her experience, and so the nature of who gets to judge is important. So when Jeff McSwain uses the term our true self, we have to ask, who are we putting in the place of being the true judge there? And so to say, as you have said, the great contradiction is that we contradict God all the time, thinking that, if only we were something, or if those people would become Christians or act more Christianly, they call themselves Christians, but they're not acting that way, that, any of those are living in the contradiction, which means there is a reality that they may not be corresponding with in their way of living and acting and being in relationship.
Great. Just one other, maybe a question on I think it's Torrance. Jesus suffered not just at the cross, but all of his life as our representative, as a sinner. But I'm thinking how that aligns with Jesus saying, there was a time coming, the hour is coming when Jesus would drink the cup. Any thoughts about that?
So Jesus, he became human like us. He took on sinful flesh. He was tempted in every way, yet without sin. So to say, if we think of sin not as just creating sinful acts, because once again, if we were to do an interview of all of the religious people within the Jesus story, they would all say he's a sinner, right? He's breaking the Sabbath, he's hanging out with the wrong people,
Mhm.
he's doing everything
Right.
wrong by virtue of what one might judge what it means to be a sinner. And yet the nature of what he was doing was to live with a connectedness to his father's will, everything that his father was doing, that's what he was doing. So he took on sinful flesh, and yet he did not sin within that. His obedience to the Father, his love from the Father for the Father, which was extended to humanity, would say that his taking on sinful flesh, as particularly I remember James Torrance talking about, but it's T.F. Torrance's view as well. When he's baptized, Jesus' baptism in the Jordan River was a baptism for repentance from sin, but he had no sins to repent from. So what was he doing there? He was going into the water on our behalf. He was going into the river to take on the sins of all humanity, in a sense, to identify with all humanity and to not merely act on his own behalf, but on our behalf. And so when we understand the nature of baptism, our own baptism, the tragedy that we make baptism, when was I baptized, in a sense misses the point. It's when did I participate in the baptism of Jesus, is to say I die with him who has died, I am raised with him who is raised. And so the nature of recognizing that he did come in the flesh, our flesh, he was baptized into the Jordan River on my behalf. He was crucified on the cross for me. He was resurrected that I might be resurrected in him. There is a sense in which Jesus has taken on all of our humanity within the whole of his life and still reigns in heaven as the one who is for us humanly. He is ascended and is human in heaven, and so still maintains that human connection to who we are, so that we have a great high priest who is not separated from us, but who is like us and understands us in every way. I'm not sure if I've spoken exactly to your point, but tell me if I'm getting close.
Yes. Yeah. A helpful thing that I underlined as Jeff is saying in somewhere else is to do with dying, us dying, is that Paul says, he doesn't say we should live as those, as if we had died, but as those who have died. And there's a difference. We truly have died, not as if we had died. Yeah. Thanks, Marty.
Dying to what is part of the question. So I have been crucified with Christ. This is T.F. Torrance's favorite verse, Galatians 2:20. I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live. I mean, there's, here's Paul speaking, and T.F. is identifying with, there's nothing of me here. I've been crucified. I no longer live. The life I now live. So there is a sense of a livingness. I live by and for T.F. it was faithfulness of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So there is a complete sense that the livingness of my present life also has a death to it. There is a death to that which was before, and a livingness which is entirely gift, and that is the life that I live now. And as a speaker, Paul is, he's obviously an agent who's writing, speaking, and so he's showing up there. And so that duality of the death and the resurrection both being present at once, I think are captured there in that. But the glory and the affirmation all goes to the aliveness. But the aliveness, as Karl Barth says, the yes of God always has a no to it, right? Whenever you say yes, you're also saying no. And so the death that is there is the no that is also present in our life because of the yes. But the yes is, first of all, God's yes, and our answer is merely an answering yes.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tim has asked the question, Marty, I'm curious about where the heuristic in theology arose in the last Zoom, as well as historically in the history of ideas. Can you fill out a bit? And he also said he found a very topical PDF directly on this subject. Can I send over the link? Yep, yes, you may. So the idea of heuristic, I'm not sure the whole history of the word heuristics, but to say that Michael Polanyi is the one who I think used it most dominantly, that T.F. Torrance may have picked it up. But if we go back to the early church fathers, Augustine is not the first one who used faith-seeking understanding, but to say the phrase faith-seeking understanding for Barth, where is the book? The idea that he got from Anselm,
Cyril?
this idea, was that?
Was it Cyril of Alexandria? Is that
Cyril
what
of
Torrance-
Alexandria is the one that TF, yeah, midline is the one who he said it first. But for Karl Barth, his book, Anselm, Fides Quentus Intellectum, is for many people kind of, it's one of the major turning points of Barth's life. And so to say, what is there about that? So fides, instead of thinking of fides as just a human attempt to find something, that if we use the word science, if science is a discovery of what is there, then there is an acknowledgement of what is there. And in the acknowledging of it, you also are open to the possibility of discovering more of what is there. Now, with something like the ocean, which is large, it's easy to see that it's there. And so to say, I have faith that the ocean is there, therefore I have faith to explore the nature of what's below the waves, what is there, and that the heuristic endeavor would be to ask the question, what can I see and what would be required to more deeply delve into the nature of what is there, which may require learning to scuba dive or to be able to be in a submarine or something like that, where the faith that it is there and that there is more to be discovered is to be opened in an appropriate Torrancean, Polanyian kind of scientific way, to say, I will never understand all of the ocean, but I will enter into it enough that I am coming to understand more of what is there. When it comes to another human being, one of the great tragedies of church is we sit next to people and don't talk to them. We don't ask questions of one another. We shake hands with them and say, good morning, which, I mean, that's a fair enough thing to say, but it just doesn't allow the heuristic dimension of what I think Paul wants to get at when he talks about hearts being knitted together in Colossians. For hearts to be knitted together, there is a sharing of story, there is a conversation of support and of mutual kind of love. The statement, by this I will know you my disciples if you love one another. Well, the love isn't just a feeling I have in my heart for another person. To say, when people have a heuristic interest in one another, a discovering sense of the other, that the love of Christ compels us to know, and we can take down the fear barriers that we have and be known, that there's something there in that space of knowing and being known in a heuristic kind of way, that is a discovery that is exactly what Karl Barth's whole church dogmatics are trying to do. God has spoken. What has he said? For you I have come, for you I have died, I am for you and with you. And so to just see that everything that Barth is doing for the 13 volumes of the church dogmatics is this discovery process. So it goes back to the early church. It may have gone back earlier. I'm not sure. The nature of Socratic method is question asking, that is somewhat heuristic. You are creating a space within which a question draws out from someone something that might be there. So that does have a bit of a heuristic dimension. In the nature of the Christian gospel, it is not our questions that shape the nature of the process. It is the nature of the God who comes and speaks that actually invites us into a knowing more deeply the one who has spoken. So it's almost 180 degrees in terms of the nature of how the process proceeds from there, which our word education, comes from the Socratic concept of to lead out, educate, to lead out. So that's building on something that is, that one might say, radically different. The book by Parker Palmer, To Know as We Are Known, assumes much of what Torrance and Barth say, is that first of all, we are known, and we come to know the one who has known us. Paul has language like this in his letters as well. When I came to know, or rather to be known, that kind of catching oneself and recognizing that one is known first and one comes to know the one who has known us. That is a positioning within a method of personal knowing that does not fall into our contemporary scientific definitions, where we try and fit people into categories and descriptions and what is measurable and so forth like that. So the nature of Einstein and Polanyi for Torrance with a heuristic approach is not to default to a form of science that is merely trying to fit what we are discovering into what we already knew, but is rather a willingness to allow all of our categories to be reformed, transformed by virtue of what, or rather who, we encounter. So that whole sense of what you get in Torrance's books on space, time, and incarnation, resurrection, the container sense, which is what he basically saw science to be doing in particularly the Newtonian framework and probably all the one before it, the container must be opened. Reality must become a dynamic, open engagement, and our approach will be to live into the openness of what is there when the container is gone and we are more allowed to actually see and hear what is there than trying to fit God into the boxes that we came to the investigation with. Is that helpful, Tim? Okay.
Thank you.
You bet. So James says, after last week, I was wondering, what would a more heuristic church be like? Would it mean being more attentive in whatever church we are in? Or would it be something new? Did Torrance write about this? That's a really good question. So there are probably many different levels we could take this on. The first heuristic dimension of the church would be to know Christ more deeply. And so I often ask myself the question in walking out, did I hear the voice of Jesus in the way that the word was preached, the way that that we were addressed as congregants? Was there a sense in which those who stood up front showed up fully as the persons that they were, but that their number one concern is that we hear the voice of a living God? Because if they do that, then we are being opened up to the heuristic experience. And again, as we mentioned last week, the nature of icons appropriately engaged is this heuristic sense, where people of a Protestant background, or even, well, any iconoclastic, you can't worship that icon. You're making images and worshiping them instead of Christ. Is like, no, you've lost the heuristic approach, the nature of what it would look like to come and to know that this is a window into a deeper, greater reality than that which can be understood here. And most Protestants aren't trained how to read an icon, to understand all the imagery of what it is that's going on. And it's always enjoyable for me to use the Rublev icon. There's Bill. He's got an icon. You probably have more than one in your room there, but so the nature of the Rublev, again, which I have right there. For many people, there is this sense in which I say, we need to allow this to be an icon. We don't want to fixate on the icon. We need to see through the icon, and that seeing through the icon is inviting them into the heuristic dimension of what it looks like, and to say, there are three persons here, and they represent or invite us into a knowing of the Father and the Son and the Spirit. It's within a biblical story, the story of Abraham, the hospitality of Abraham. And so there's something of the hospitable life of God that invites us into this place. And so this would be a heuristic invitation. And to talk about the nature of the vanishing point coming off the front, that the nature of the icon itself invites us into the life of God. Well, that's an invitation, a heuristic invitation to live within what the icon is inviting, that we too might sit at this table with persons. And yes, they are human persons, and the Father, Son, and Spirit aren't all human, and yet they invite us into the personal presence of those who invite us. So for a church service to really, in a Trinitarian kind of way, to have this sense of the invitation into the presence, the speaking, one of the things that I hope to do someday, and I've started actually doing this, is rewriting some of Paul's letters in the voices of the persons of the Trinity. So instead of, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the God of all blessing, who has blessed us in the heavenly places in him, that's a third person kind of perspective. So the Father says, I am the Father who's blessed you in the heavenly places through my Son. And there's a heuristic dimension there that now the Father is there, and the Father speaks. And we know the Father says, this is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased, listen to him. And so now we are beginning to hear the Father speaking. And so there's a heuristic dimension that, oh, you're not just out there, you're here, you speak through the written word. And then in Jesus, blessed be my Father who's blessed you in the heavenly places through me. Now, Jesus is not one who we just think, I'm a Jesus-focused person, therefore I can only talk about Jesus. It's like, no, Jesus recognizes that everything he's doing, it's the love of his Father who is sending, who is acting through him. And so heuristically, we're seeing Jesus not as an end in himself, but as one through whom we come to know and by the Spirit cry out, Abba, Father. Because we hear a voice that is not an end in himself. We don't just take the verse, we indwell it. We go beyond it to enter into the invitation that is there. With the Spirit, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who blesses us in the heavenly places of him. The Spirit very much corresponds with the witness of what is there, because that's the work that the Spirit does. The Spirit enables a heuristic engagement. So a church where we're thinking in Trinitarian kind of ways, where we're hearing the nature of the God who speaks, and that he addresses each of us in a sense, particularly, as well as also congregationally. That would just be a beginning point. There is a sense in which the high priestly prayer in John 17, all the ases, as is this little word, as the Father's loved me and I've now love one another, and as the Father sent me, so send I you. There's something about the dynamic of entering into the icon or into the experience of knowing those persons that then invites us to turn to one another and to be able to say, tell me who you are today. Tell me how I might be a brother or sister for you. Who are you and who might I be for you? That would bring the mutuality of knowing and being known, which again, the end of 1 Corinthians 13, now we see in part, but then we will know face to face. Now through a mirror dimly, then face to face, this image of knowing in part. I think that we just don't even know one another in part in a way that we should, much less really in the more full sense of what face to face might mean, which with Moses, like a friend, God would meet with Yahweh face to face. This image of friendship being something that's there. So if we could move our churches beyond just a gathering of people into the egg carton and think that just being there in the egg carton, that's all it's there, but that there's something about the nature of the way that we take time to listen and respond and know and be known. What keeps us from knowing and being known is the fear of what the other will think. And we have not acknowledged very well in our church services the nature of the fear of what others think that keeps us from showing up authentically. And therefore, there can be no heuristic engagement with who we are with one another. And in a sense, we're hiding before God. We're Adam and Eve hiding in the bushes. And so to say a church service where we deeply and profoundly know the one who speaks to us, who embraces us, and to live within that every week so that people walk out every week saying, I've discovered more of who God is, and I've discovered more of who I am as the one addressed. And I've discovered one or two people, and I've been able to let down, and the word persona, mask, persona comes from the Greek theater, the wearing of a mask. I've been able to take my persona off and to be a person who, in a sense, has dropped the fig leaf. I am vulnerable. I am present. I am entrusting myself to these other persons. There is in that, I think, the weaving together of something of knowing and being known. And some people have said, yeah, you can't do that in a big church, which there are little churches that this could more easily happen in. I think in a big church, you can still have one person turn to another person. I've done this before. So, I mean, I know it works. Just do it with one person. There may be 1,000 people around you, just with one. Let's create the safe space where the Spirit allows us just for a few moments to be present with one another. There are small groups that have 5 or 6 people, and they never let down the mask, right? The size of the group does not ultimately determine the nature of the mask that keeps us from heuristically being open to what it means to grow together in the presence of Christ, and the power of the Spirit, and to be transformed by that. Until we recognize how fear cripples us and imprisons us, we will forever live with this self-focusedness, which I will say what John McMurray, the Scottish philosopher, said: ultimate fear is an ultimate concern for self. The more we are afraid, the more we will become self-focused and self-protective. Ultimate love is an ultimate concern for the other, which does not lose concern for oneself. So love has this freeing. And so at this point, we say love in that mode is the heuristic reorientation of our world to be fully who we are and to be fully for the other in such a way that words like communion and community and all that actually take on an authentic expression of reality. Is this getting anywhere close to answering your question?
So so it's on a personal level.
Well, so the question, that's a big question right there. So when we say on the personal level, and this is where to say the work by Polanyi, personal knowledge, is to say that science is on the personal level. All science is on the personal level. And art, guess what? All art is on the personal level. And so to say in the same way, Torrance's use of Polanyi is to say all of what we would call the life of faith is all on the personal level. Why is that true? Because God is person and engages with us personally. We are persons created in the image of God, and the fullness of our humanity coming alive is to become fully personal.
Yeah.
When we become something impersonal, this, Martin Buber's I, thou, I, it. When we treat others as merely a thing, then it's an I, it relationship. That's impersonal. And many churches, the way that people engage in churches is a very I-it experience. And so your comment there, yes, it needs to be more personal because we are not a bunch of its.
Yeah.
We are I's and thou's. And so either we live true to what we are, or we're being something false. And the nature of the gospel is to take those falsehoods away.
Yes. What you're describing in a way, it would seem more possible in the kind of thing we're doing now in this discussion than in a church in a way, or than in many churches.
I think we have simply so become used to the franchise of what our churches do that we have not become heuristic enough to ask every Sunday, how can we grow into the life of the fullness of the one who loves us, who accompanies us during the week, to bring that to our gathering together? And so in some ways, traditions can be helpful in reminding and all that, but they can become their own end, and they don't take us in that indwelling in the way that Polanyi talks about, that, the words on the page they may be important, but if you just look at the words and don't ask, what do these words allow me to enter into, then they will become a block. The Book of Kells is beautiful. I don't read the language that it would draw me into. So all I can do is look at the book and say, how beautiful and what an amazing time in history it must have been for these monks to create this beautiful set of words. I wish I could read them. Right? And so for many, our churches are beautiful and our services have a lot of beauty to them. I just think that they've become a lot like the Book of Kells, and they're not getting us into the heuristic dimension of really indwelling them in a way that could be there. And this is where I wish that I could see the academy shift what it is that it does. Right now, the academy trains people to teach the traditions of the church in very rational kinds of ways, arguments, definitions. My wife is a dentist, and she said a dentistry at the University of Washington who does a PhD, that's where she went. If they do a PhD, they have to learn progressively advanced ways of providing medications or procedures, something that's going to get used in dental chairs around the country sometime soon. So that idea, I'm doing research because my discipline needs people who can keep it moving forward. I don't know of a single school of theology or biblical studies that really has that kind of a mentality. We need to study theology so that we can serve the churches of many traditions, to find ways to not just throw out traditions, but to keep growing the tradition so that it maintains an aliveness, so we don't lose the richness of where we've come from, but that we're always living into the possibility of doing things in a way that shake us up enough that we keep seeing it anew, heuristically, and keep exploring in ways that don't just collapse back into familiar couches.
Hmm.
If I addressed your
Yeah, maybe some of the other people want you to address their points as well.
we'll go back and so Howard says Michael Reeves has said that icons are windows to the other side. I found that helpful. Yeah. And the other trick is the other side still has some sense of not here in my space. That great scene in Dickens' A Christmas Carol, where Scrooge's eyes are open and he's able to see the whole spiritual dimension that's going on. Different movies bring different levels of quality, but he has been transformed as a person. He who had been entirely self-consumed sees a whole world, and he can see the poor and the people who are outside, and he sees them I think with compassion, maybe for the first time. So not only does he see this whole spiritual world, he sees them with compassion. And is he seeing the other side, or is he seeing what was always there, but he was blind to be able to see it?
Yeah, it's
And
kind of
so-
like sometimes like shadows, or even the shadows on the cave of the wall in Plato.
Yeah.
But I think he was the one who said, or someone I heard about the same time, but the picture of Grunewald where John the Baptist is pointing to the cross of
Yeah.
Christ. He said a lot of times that's what icons are meant to do, are
That's
to
right.
point us. They're not the object of reverence, but rather they are to transmit us through, get us out of our mundane world into a place where we can appreciate the spiritual side of things.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That helped me. I often use icons in my sermons, as sermon illustrations. They have no clue what they are, but they like the pictures.
Yes. Well, I am a great affirmer of using icons. Somebody once said, the icons in our church are our family photos. They remind us that it's not just those who are sitting here that are our family, but that our family is deep and rich, and that we have much to discover, not only of who they were, but who they are as the voices that still speak to us today, which I think is also a heuristic listening attitude. So, yeah, I think icons have a profound capacity to do that bridging kind of piece.
You
In
don't have
Celtic,
to, you don't have to understand them either. I mean, you don't have to know what they are or who they are. They're still communicating.
they are communicating,
Yeah.
but you can also you can see a John the Baptist with a tree with a hatchet and go, oh, there's a John the Baptist where the hatchet is set to the tree, and the
Yeah,
warning sense of
yeah.
what is there, and you begin to get a sense of, oh yeah, it's that person again, but slightly different. And there are different Rublevs that follow the basic structure of it, but introduce slightly different modalities that you see something you hadn't seen before. And so the nature of the form of the Rublev, you always know, okay, this is an echo of the Rublev, but it's also giving me new eyes to see. And so I think that sense of the oldness and the newness. I saw once a saying that said, the best way to be original is to go back to the origins. And I think it's because we do forget so much. And yet when we do go back, we see new things. And so to express those as well is part of this heuristic give and take of growing that is appropriate for a living thing, which is what the body of Christ is supposed to be, and not merely something that's calcified or codified in a way where that gets lost.
Yeah.
In Celtic Christianity, they talk about thin places, the Isle of Iona being one of those. And there is this sense that sometimes we get of heaven is not far here. I think there is a sense in which we're supposed to really live and be expectant that maybe all places are thin places. It tends to be that those thin places are places that we consider to be of great beauty. I wonder to what degree Teresa of Calcutta, being with the poor on the streets of Calcutta, had a sense of thin places by virtue of the heart of God for these people who were, in a sense, the outcast of a society. And so to have our eyes open to see, in a sense, all places as thin places is part of living into this heuristic dimension, which is maybe to have the eyes of the spirit is to be opened in a heuristic discovery of the world around us and to see things that we otherwise would not have seen.
There's several really good older icons on what they call Holy Saturday, when Christ broke down the gates of hell and went in. And I always get the feeling when I walk away from it, there's really not a whole lot there biblically to support it. But when I look at these, I think, boy, I wish there was, I mean, I know it's trying to fill in the blanks that we don't know about, but I do enjoy it nonetheless. You know, there's this gate on the ground, and you look and you can see Satan pinned under the gate. You know.
Right. Yeah, and the question of what Tolkien maybe calls the backstory in The Lord of the Rings is that there are things that one can say are in the forestory, i.e. what is written in the biblical text. But there are things that are worth exploring that are backstory kinds of things. And maybe we could say that the icon there with certain of its elements, they are in a sense playing out the backstory that is there. The Rodin, you know, the thinker, Rodin's thinker, is part of an entryway into the gates of hell. And to recognize that the individual human thinker in and of themselves, by themselves, in a sense separated, that individualistic, rationalistic way of thinking sits at the gates of hell. Now, the nature of the biblical texts don't necessarily have the thinker sitting at the gates of hell, and yet there is something, a backstory that is there that says, if we think that being the thinker is going to be at the gates of heaven, we may be sitting at the wrong gate.
Yeah.
And I think Howard, your illustration of the Holy Saturday icon and the resurrection following it, it's playing out in ways that help us to see and understand things that are truer than what we can get by just seeing the text the way we've always seen it, and to maybe see that there is more implied there that speaks to us.
Yeah. It's not on the order of the proto-evangelium of James, who has all these mythologies that came into the church, you know. But this one, you know, like you said, maybe there's a little bit of Rodin laying around with the rationalism of, well, this must have what happened, you know, but it has to be symbolic. Otherwise, it doesn't have any meaning.
That's right. So. Yeah. And this is the way I read Paul Young's The Shack. He's not attempting to write a theology. He's asking us to think outside of the box, and to not allow our past readings of the nature of God to so limit us that we miss dimensions of God that might be there. So to have God the Father show up as Papa, a black woman, is for the person who's faced this tragedy in his life to recognize, if you go back to your old images of God, you will never discover the compassionate, loving God who is envisioned in showing him this particular way. And there does come another point where he's going to find his daughter's body, where on that day, God shows up as a male to take him out to find his daughter's body. And I think the dynamic of that, where we're just saying, we can't get so locked into our image of God that we don't let God keep speaking to us afresh and anew, but to always know that it's that God, that heart, that speaking, that all of these things that we would say are the constancy, the continuity of God, those things need to be in place. There are some things that don't need that continuity. They become limitations in our thinking.
Yeah, you're in the danger of going back to an old image of God. You've got your God in the box under your arm, and you just kind of peek in there once in a while, see if he's still there. What good is he? You know, you've got him all figured out and labeled and everything. So
I'm going to move on here. Let's see, Bill, you said Torrance writes about it in a simple story. What was the story you were thinking of there?
Well, I was referring to Jim's question. Did Torrance write about heuristic approach in church? The story that comes to my mind is that very familiar story. I think perhaps you know it, Jim, when Torrance was serving as a stretcher bearer, a chaplain in World War II, comes upon a young dying soldier, has 30 minutes to live. And the soldier, before he dies, asks, "Padre, is God really like Jesus?" And Torrance mentions that story, and also the fact that he was asked that same question again at a parish back home in Scotland. is God really like Jesus? By an elderly woman, as I recall.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Who had cancer, I
Yeah.
think.
And I
Yeah.
think that's where the heuristic approach begins. It should
Mm.
begin in any
Yeah.
church, any congregation, is on that foundation.
Yeah.
The answer to that question, to find out heuristic.
Yeah. Good. Thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. That was a great insight. So, Todd, you are wondering about baptism, regarding Christ's baptism being our baptism in repentance and being the transformation of us. Quote, all-inclusive vicarious humanity of Christ. Would you say this passage from Jesus' high priestly prayer is relevant? Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. As you have sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And for their sake, I consecrate myself, that they may also be sanctified in truth. I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word. So, wondering about baptism. So you've got a lot packed in here. I'm just trying to hear the essence of your question. Do you want to give me the nutshell of your question, Todd?
Okay, I get maybe it's a couple of questions, I guess, on that passage. Is that would you say that passage is talking about the vicarious humanity of Christ, that him, quote, learning obedience through the things that he suffered, him, quote, becoming obedient to the point of death on the cross, him working out our obedience in our fallen flesh and bringing all of humanity into full repentance through him, through his life. And is that passage, I'm assuming, it seems to me that's what that passage is talking about. And is that a helpful passage to, you think, you think that's what that's talking about?
So, I mean, I think that the word vicarious is very appropriate for the high priestly prayer. It also is an invitational vicariousness. And by that, I mean the as within it is an invitation, right? So Christ is one with the Father, and the invitation is for us to live in the reality of what Christ has done for us. He has brought us to be one with the Father. And so for us to actually live as though that is true, instead of that there's some other sense that there's only Jesus and not the Father, or that the Father is an angry Father, or any of those other things, which we need metanoia, or change of mind, that the nature of Jesus' way of being with the Father, which becomes a way that he invites his disciples to live as a community with the same love, with the same being sent, that vicarious does not dismiss us, it invites us, right? So the high priestly prayer on behalf of the disciples is a prayer that the Father's work and ultimately the Spirit's work will be that we will live within the reality, the truth, the initiation and continuation and completion that Jesus always is bringing to us by the Spirit, to live fully alive within what Jesus has done and is doing for us and with us, and that we don't merely passively sit back or anything. And so our baptism into Christ's baptism isn't to say, well, he did it, and so, I'll just go into the water and come out, and then I'll go on my merry way because I've passed the entrance exam. No, it's now you're married, so live like it. Right? Live into your marriage, live the life of love, discover what it looks like every day anew. And so we are brought into the marriage language that Paul talks about in Ephesians, that the relationship Christ has with his church is one that he encourages for husbands and wives, which is to say that there's full participation on everyone's part. Nobody is passive. Who is the initiator? clearly Christ. Christ is the one who has given life to the church, who sustains his church, who serves his church, who does all. Is the church passive? No. As God's holy and beloved people, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another, forgiving one another, just as he forgave you. There's that's another as kind of sense there. So the sense of the all-inclusive vicariousness, absolutely, completely vicarious and absolutely invitational.
Interesting. And if we were going to baptize you into being our liturgy writer here, my other question is: let's say you have a lineup of 12-year-olds who've come to faith in Christ and they're being baptized. What might be one sentence? Maybe you'd have a different sentence for each of them, but what might be one sentence that you'd say over each as you're baptizing them, besides Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? Or maybe you wouldn't. Maybe you don't need to say anything. I don't know. Or maybe a statement, as some churches do. They have the baptizee say a little statement before going under, or however they do the baptism. Anyway, what might be a helpful thing that would be that would help the church that's there witnessing, and help that young disciple in the baptism experience.
And I'm trying to remember the exact words that J.B. Torrance quotes from the French liturgy that is used in baptism. Do you remember that?
Sort of, yeah.
I have literally used that before, but I had it written out. I don't have it memorized.
Yeah, and it's almost like it rather admits that it's talking about an infant, because it says, though you don't know him now, for you, he battled in Gethsemane. For you, he fasted in the desert, whatever, for you, he has battled the evils of the world, et cetera, et cetera. And though you do not know it yet. And he has, something like that. He has secured for you a place in his sonship, essentially.
Yeah, so that's very vicarious in all that language. So to speak to them, for you, all of this has preceded what is happening this day. And when you are baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, to speak their name is to say they are present here. And to say in their name means you are being brought into their family. When we get married, the woman takes on the name of the husband. In a sense, we are taking on the name of the Father, Son, and the Spirit. When you are being baptized here, you are taking on the being in their family. And so they have named themselves to name you after them. And as you go down into the water, the old name that you were and had, in a sense, will still be there, but you have a new name. And Peter, I'm no longer going to call you Cephas. I'm going to call you Rock, because you see who I am. You got the answer right. Who do you say I am? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Peter, you know me in such a way that I can't use the old name for who you are. I need to give you a new name because you're a new person. So in baptism, to say, and Jim, I'm wondering about your Greek name and at what point you took on the Greek name. But I think there is a value in having our name changed at baptism as an acknowledgement that we are by being baptized into Christ, there is a sense in which we say we are new persons in the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. David, do you want to say something about that? Iakonos is your Greek name, is that right?
Yeah, so was a little bit unusual in my case, because my my Greek name is actually it's the same name. It's James. It's just the Greek version of James.
To say the Greek version of it does something.
Yeah, but it is different. It's distinct. Yeah.
Yes.
But I was actually baptized. Well, my Orthodox baptism was on Mount Athos. a monastery called Grigoriou, and I think usually a name is given to you. So the abbot or your spiritual father gives you the name. But I think I said I wanted that name, so I think that might have been a little bit unusual. But yeah, I did want a different name. I wanted something different. So I think that is important.
Right. Right. So Todd, I think names at baptism could be a more meaningful part of saying, we will no longer look at you as the same person. You're being baptized into the Father, Son, Spirit. Again, it's this, you're the same person, but you're not, because of whose name is inviting you into this new place and way of being. And for you, Jim, the nature of somebody hearing your Greek name and saying, and why are you called that, is an opportunity for a heuristic conversation of who you are as a person of faith, and that's associated with it. So it invites also, I think, people into an understanding or a knowing of you, which I would call a heuristic opening through name. So does that work for you, Todd?
Well, I'm not sure it's okay. So let me make this more difficult, and let me be persnickety here. Can you boil it down into one sentence? You've got little Jennifer in front of you, and she's professing new faith in Christ, or she just been confirmed or something at your church, and you're having a baptism service. What are you going to, will there be one sentence you say that kind of encapsulates it and helps us all celebrate with her and be part of the body of Christ with her and helps her have something to remember? And
little Jennifer, though today you are speaking your part, know this: before you could speak, Jesus came for you. He embraced you in death. He embraces you in life. He embraces you into the resurrection. As you go into the water, you are going into his life. You are confirming what he has done for you.
Yeah. So essentially, it's sort of like we're saying yes to his yes to us, huh?
Yep. Which is, I mean, Bart uses the capital Y yes and the little y yes in that pairing of it as a response. So to say, at some level, the life of faith is a daily saying yes to the yes of God for us, which is a love that is not merely a generalized yes, it's the specific yes of a specific person who this very moment is saying yes to you, and saying yes to love being what you hear, what you affirm, so that your yes is a loving response to him and to whoever else it is that is within your sphere of communicating, of touching. That is the ethic of Karl Barth.
Thanks.
So Bill, you've got another comment up here. Citation of French. Oh, it's that you found it. The Reformed Liturgy, James Torrance. For you, little child, Jesus Christ has come. He has fought. He has suffered. For you, he entered the shadow of Gethsemane and the horror of Calvary. For you, he uttered the cry, "It is finished." For you, he rose from the dead and ascended into heaven, and there he intercedes for you, little child, even though you do not know it. But in this way, the word of the gospel becomes true. We love him because he first loved us. So yeah, that's there's the whole life, death, resurrection, and current present of the ministry of Jesus symbolized in the baptism. It's a real experience that brings us into what it is, and acknowledging the reality of his love as the dominant motif in this moment, and that what we are doing is merely a response, a confirming response that is an articulation of our love for him in response. Thanks, Bill, for finding that. Does anyone have any other thoughts, questions, comments?
Could we don't have to give an answer to this immediately, but I'm
Okay.
looking for a little bit of a bibliography. I'm been given the honor and privilege of dedicating several of the Cambodian children in January. And what I want to affirm is the idea of the children as part of the family of God. As Paul Tripp, he says that we as parents are to be like ambassadors to the children. But I'm trying to find something that in Torrance, either of the Torrances who might support that idea a bit more, that I could develop, to challenge them a little bit on the relationship with the parents, that is a channel for their the child's relationship with God. I mean, that's kind of broad, but I mean, like I said, if you don't have something now, you can mention it in a text or something later, but
Right. Well, I mean, there is the initial obvious sense that we are children of God. First John and chapter 3, and the whole idea that the Spirit moves in us when we cry out, Abba, Father. The nature of the Abba cry is also an acknowledgement of our being children of the Father. The role of the parents, the sections in Ephesians and Colossians, there is a sense in which where they are positioned within those books, there is a sense in which the life of the family is lived within the life of all that, what James Torrance talked about, the indicatives of grace that are the first half of those books, call forth the imperatives of law. And by that law, it's Torah law, it's the wisdom of living within the family that's been established by the indicatives of grace. And so to say the nature of the parental admonitions that are there, those are all a participation within what it is that is happening within the work of God's work in the person of Christ, who's the invisible becoming visible. And so, the Colossians passage where it transitions from all that, particularly in 3 at verse 12, as God's holy and beloved people, is that just the congregation or is that the parents? Because it's going to go on within a few verses to talk about the parents. And so I'd say, as God's holy and beloved people, focusing down includes the parents. Put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness. Those things, those statements, I think I'll echo Exodus 34:6, when Yahweh passes before Moses, the Lord, gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and faithfulness. That the very nature of God revealed to Moses there, which becomes what the Bible Project calls the John 3:16 of the Old Testament, the proclamation of God's love. I think they got verse 7 wrong in the Bible Project, but that's another topic. The nature of the character of God, gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness, that whole dimension of the presence of the way God shows up, that then Paul is inviting the community as God's holy and beloved people put on a heart of compassion, the nature of the heart of the people of God, that then becomes the heart of parents and the way that they treat, care for, even discipline their children. It's all lived within the revelation of God, the revelation of the church as those who echo what it is that God is doing or being and then creates, and to totally switch to another field of thought, creates the safe environment that attachment therapy talks about. For a child to become a healthy individual, there is a sense of being in a loving, secure environment. If they either feel like
Yeah.
they are not loved, or that there's a problem with their parents, that they can't love their parents, then they will enter in a fear that begins the disintegration of, in a sense, the spirit of a child, and they become
Yeah.
in some form of dysfunction, which maybe is why we have such a dysfunctional country. But the whole nature of the admonitions of Colossians and Ephesians is the profound level of God's creating the space within which we are fully secure in his love and his life, that becomes the very lifeblood of a community, and that goes down to the many communities of families who bring that same expression to them.
I've been reworking through this. They usually will make a comment, something about how, the family is God's plan for this and that, and it's almost as if the family is meant to replace the church. And
Right.
I wanted to encourage them, and I don't want to discourage them at the same time. But I thought I kind of like Tripp's idea of ambassadors, of, that we're the ones who carry the message and the purpose of the kingdom to our children. And like you said, I like that idea of creating a safe environment for them to know who Christ is. So it's
Yeah. No, ambassadors is a fine word. I was in China heading to the Great Wall, and there was another guy on the bus who spoke British. And I said, and so what are you doing here? And he says, well, I'm the mouthpiece for the Queen. I says, what does that mean? He says, I'm the one who the Queen sends when she wants somebody to speak in a particular context and she can't be there. And so, I love that image. I am not the Queen, and yet the Queen has given me a kind of authority where when I speak, she trusts me. And she sends me as one who will speak that. And so to say, parents, with all humility, right? It isn't, God made me your boss. That would be problematic. But beloved child of mine and of God, let me bring to you the words that I think he would say to you. You are absolutely loved. Right now you are struggling with, ABC. But for you, my hope is that the words of the one who loves you would speak in word and in deed through me, so that you would know who you are as one absolutely loved, and that even the discipline that you experience, that you would recognize that God's love disciplines us, and that, there you're going to Hebrews chapter 12. We had fathers who disciplined us for a while. He disciplines us that we may share his holiness. And again, holiness is this fulfillment of being this wholeness. Therefore, it goes on, bind up the limb that is out of place. And it's this whole sense that we would hope that parents would do, of picking up the broken pieces and bringing them to a wholeness, so that discipline is not merely I'm going to whip you into shape. It is the whole life embracement that engages all that might be broken, to bring a sense of, what I see in the image of the highway of holiness, where the desert becomes a garden, that our children become the gardens that they are intended to be because of the way that we are with them. That's what I see happening there in that Hebrews 12 passage.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good. Thank you. I'll don't be surprised if you get a text back, a message back
Texts
on
are
it.
fine.
Would you explain that again, please? No, but that's good.
Yes.
All right. Gentlemen, I have to run. My wife's birthday, and we're going out later, so I need to go get ready for that. So
My
but thank
wife's
you.
birthday
This has
was 2
been-
days ago, so
Oh, really?
it must be a
Yeah.
season for wives having birthdays or
Yeah.
something.
Well,
Blessings on you,
happy
Howard.
birthday
Thanks for
to
being
her.
here.
All right,
Yes,
thank
and to
you.
your
Thank
wife
you
as
all.
well.
Blessings.
Blessings on you. Anyone else have thoughts that are circulating in those brilliant minds?
I have a little anecdote to
Okay.
share. After all the, well, that session last week, all the discussion about heuristics, which I thoroughly enjoyed and learned from. Thank you.
Yeah.
I had occasion to spend quite a bit of time with my son, who is doing his doctorate at University of Denver, or Denver University, political science, military, as it applies in the military. And he said, you know, in my prospectus, I used the word heuristic. I brought it up. We were talking about it, and he said, I said, you did? I don't recall reading that. And he said, oh yeah, that's right. I dumbed it down. I said, what? He said, I dumbed it down to theory generating approach.
Hmm.
At first he said, I'm using a heuristic approach. Then he said, no, I'm going to change this to theory generating approach. This is within the political science realm.
Right.
Does that fit? Can I
Well-
take back the critique?
Yeah. The problem with the word theory is it comes from the associated word of theater, which means that we are observers. Theory is moving back into an observing position, which is separated, whereas heuristic is profoundly engaged. And so if we use the word wonder, it moved me into a wonder creating motif or something like that. Wonder draws us forward, or curiosity. There's a Einstein quote, I am neither clever nor especially gifted. I am only very, very curious. And if we take that sense of Einstein's whole approach in why it is that he asked the questions that he did, pursued understanding the nature of light and space and time and gravity and all these things, that he wasn't trying to create a theory as much as he was bound to ask questions, to be curious about these things without them necessarily creating a theory. I mean, he did create theories, but it's the sense of curiosity that is the focal point, not the theory. And a good teacher awakens tons of wonder in children rather than having them walk out with a theory.
Well, I just wonder if it's context in the sense that we're talking about political science versus
Yep.
physical science, for and theology, of course. But it's interesting that he
It is
he said,
interesting, yeah. I
said, "Oh,
think,
yeah."
I mean, I'm fine with theory insofar as it's an elastic theory that's open to keeping a growing process always before us, kind of.
Well, when I read him, actually, what Torrance had written about Polanyi,
Yeah,
I actually read that to him. I had quite a bit of time with him on the phone. He was traveling from Denver to Redwood Valley, California by car right
Okay.
before, I mean, I'm talking through the Donner Pass, where, Jim, we just had 6 feet of snow in the Donner Pass area in Truckee on the western slope of the Sierras. He went right through there after we were checking the weather the day before it hit. Actually, the afternoon before it came in the next morning into the Redwood Valley, and to pick up a puppy, a dog from a kennel. Anyway, we had lots of time to talk.
wow, no, that's wonderful.
We talked about heuristics. Can
Yeah.
you believe it? For
Yeah,
a bit.
well, we might
For
need to have him on and just discuss. I mean, I think that as you're saying, every context brings its own light to a word.
Yeah.
And so I think that there are things that that would be helpful understanding in political science. What is it he's doing with that? My sensibility with political science is that so much of politics is dealing with, the billboard and what's put out there on the platform that isn't heuristic. It doesn't go into, what are all the reasons why this is being said? And so if we were to do a heuristic study of what's going on right now within the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the independents, we would learn to keep exploring what are the values that each of these systems are putting forward, and how is it that they think that these particular political moves are furthering it? How much of what they're doing is simply blocking others? Sometimes when you're playing checkers or Chinese checkers, you're just trying to block the other person.
Yeah.
And so, to what degree is political science really advancing something? To what degree is it blocking something? Is there really a vision for what it looks like to be public servants? Political science, in the context of the term public servants, and though we don't use the word ministers here like they do in the UK, minister is intended to mean, one who serves a group of people, but are thinking about political ministry positions as somebody who's in control, right? You're the head of a department or the head of a particular something. So the whole nature of how control functions in political science. And so all of these questions at one level is just investigating what is. The question, what could be, I mean, this would be a T.F. Torrance. If we think out of the nature of the God who comes and serves in the person of Jesus and calls for people to be servants of communities and servants of neighborhoods, how would a theological vision inform political science that was corrective of those ways that politicians are acting, which can only be fear-based and can only be divisive, hence contrary to any theological kind of agenda? And what would it look like for them to serve in ways that are functioning in context, particular towns or counties or cities or whatever it is that is their domain, but to ask what are the values that would drive a more healthy manner of this place and the people within it functioning together? Because the polis is it's the people. How do the people get along? It's all about relationships, right? But those relationships are tangibly expressed in the rules of the game that are set in those places.
I think
And
by
again,
theory, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that the article that I wrote for the Polanyi Journal on a game-changing strategy is, what would it look like if Polanyi had used as a metaphor, instead of setting science and faith against each other on a chessboard, to say the nature of science and faith, and we could put here politics and faith, and say, what would it look like for them to figure out how each other could win? Lose the fewest number of pieces and get all of your pieces across the other side of the board. So to say, politicians and people of faith within a town or a county or wherever they are, if their job was to work together so that each other would quote unquote win, and we have to determine what winning is, it would be a different game with better outcomes for a life of service in doing what both of them in a sense are called to do, and that is to serve the people. So anyway, go ahead.
Well, perhaps in a book, The Theology and Reconstruction, Torrance's book, he wrote that Michael Polanyi reminds us in his Guilford lectures that we cannot convince others by formal argument. For so long as we argue within their framework, we can never induce them to abandon it.
That's right. Profound.
So but then he quotes Polanyi, formal operations relying on one framework of interpretation cannot demonstrate a proposition to persons who rely on another framework, unquote. That almost seems.
If you think of the framework of Polanyi in Poland being taken by the scientific community of, at that point, the communist government, and they were using the word science, but their framework was science to control the people and to produce means of control. And so the nature of that framework would not allow them to do anything that he called science, that Polanyi would call science. In a sense, they were both science because they were dealing with the physical world and, measurements and chemistry and all these things. And yet the framework completely determined the nature of what that scientific framework was being used for. So he went to Manchester then, where he could pursue another sense of what science would look like. And it was there that he reflected on what had happened and began to recognize the social dimension of what was going on there in the governmental control of science, and begin to do a heuristic study into, it's not just science, it's all of these layers of what political ways of functioning are doing. And so he became more of a scientist of sociology there at Manchester, and that moved him towards his writing of personal knowledge, because he had done this heuristic work of asking how was the abuse of science an opportunity to learn that about the way science works within these frameworks, both in their abuse and also their possibilities. And he does go on, to affirm in his writings about the role of faith, opening us up to more heuristic ways of being the most political systems will give us. There is more liberation when faith is appropriately done than what happens in science, particularly when it's being used in ways that are merely for those who have power at the top. So faith there again becomes almost synonymous with the word heuristic. Heuristics seeking understanding, right?
Yes, from the
And
Greek
he says,
to find.
what's that?
From the Greek to find, from the Greek word to find.
Yep,
Is
yep.
that correct? Heuristic?
Heuristic to find, yeah. So it's faith is a finding. So there is a finding that has so much more to find. So it's finding, in a sense, the beginning point to be in the finding process.
And so theory generating, I get that doesn't fit in theology. I get that. I think I get that.
Well, again, it depends on how you're using the word theory. In its core sense and the way that most people use it, theory, as I just read in Bart, theory is a generalizing statement that deals with things that might generally be true. The moment you create a theory, you have something that needs to be generally true. He says you've left the specific. That he says theology always needs to deal with the specific of God in the person of the specific person of Christ. And that person will speak in different communities down to each person. I mean, he doesn't want to give us Christian marriages and Christian whatever. It's the generalizing, he says, violates the whole nature of it. Your theory has gotten rid of the reality.
What about the idea of form, perhaps? If you're being heuristic,
I have an example of that.
It's not just details, is it? It's like Einstein, he has a theory, or he has a form. There's a structure.
Yeah.
And Bart, he has a form.
Yeah.
It's not just that they're given details, insights. Right. They put it into a form, don't they?
Yeah, I think you're pointing at the epistemological approach is a form of approach. So to tie the nature of the form of approach isn't the form of the conclusion, but it is the form of the investigation. And so I think that if the nature of your theory is the form of an investigation, then it's a much more helpful kind of thing.
Yeah.
So to say, the first class I took in college was music theory with the intent of being a vocal music instructor in high school. I hated theory. It was too constraining. The form of what they made you do with little dots and things on the page was nothing like the singing of the song, which is really what I love to do and to bring people into that. And so your use of the word form there, if the form of education had been, if my teachers had taught me theory through singing, I may be a music teacher today,
Yeah.
but the form of it was like death. So the nature of music theory is what's on the page, but when you hear the Ode to Joy done by a wonderful choir and symphony, and you're sitting there in the middle of it, there's something that the word theory is out of your mind. There is a profound experience that is happening, and you just can't be untouched sitting in the middle of that. And so to be sitting in the middle of it and to be taken, in a sense, where the song takes you, which the words to it, I mean, theologically, they're pretty rich too. Joyful, joyful, we adore thee, God of glory, Lord of love, hearts unfold like flowers before you. I mean, this is heuristic language, right? Opening to the sun above, melt the clouds of sin and sadness, drive the dark of doubt away. I mean, it's all profound visions of heuristic uncovering and exploring. So to say, could we do a theory of what's happening in that moment? Yeah, we probably could, but I don't know if I want to quite. Or I want to do it with the right people who keep that all alive. So I think there's something about what you're saying about form that is important. I think that if you've just listened to the Ode to Joy, it's better than if you haven't heard it for years and somebody gets out the book and opens it up. That the form of investigation would be quite different, and one of them would be much more life-giving than the other. And insofar as we mean the form of the investigation, I totally agree with you.
You know, just speaking of the joy, the Ode to Joy.
Yes.
There is posted yesterday I found it I came across it on Facebook, what appeared to be a very small rendition by a cellist. Is it cellist or cellist, right?
You know what you're talking
about. A woman playing just in an open plaza, and slowly the whole orchestra begins to join them. And as the orchestra and the parts of the orchestra come together on this open plaza, including a choir, an audience begins to form. And you should see the kids and the reaction to this beautiful. It's the fourth movement in the Ninth Symphony, right? It's interesting, those lyrics. I was so moved by this video, this flash mob video clip of that I did a little research on Ode to Joy. It's interesting that those lyrics, written in the early 20th century, came 30 years after Beethoven's lyrics. And it was actually, he based it on a poem from the 18th century. I can't think of the guy's name, but it was originally a pagan lyrics, Elysium, right? That a churchman in the 20th century changed the lyrics. Did you know that? I didn't know that until it was really interesting to learn that if you Google original lyrics of Ode to Joy, you'll find reference to Greek mythology. And it's been overcome and replaced now with
Well,
Christian
the way
lyrics.
that it's been overcome is quite amazing. J.B. Torrance once said, the nature of the history of Christianity is in many ways a usurping of symbols. What we call the Celtic cross, with a cross with a circle, that was the way churches were built over Celtic places of worship. And so it's incorporated in there many of the Greek female images were made into images of Mary. So there is, I mean, Christmas itself and Easter, I mean, all of these have echoes of other traditions. And yet there is something in that. When we say the word echo, one could say there is an original sense in which, you know, the God who creates the world and creates women and worship has called all humanity to worship. And some of them have acknowledged the true creator, and others have, you know, worshiped in other ways, but we are all worshiping creatures at some level. And one can say it's all more complex. And the question, was this song in any way violated, or was it given, you know, a richer, fuller extension of something that brought it to the glory of God? And we don't have to use the words like took away from or anything like that, but it is a continuing addition of the life of creative persons who are captured by the love of God in such a way that it comes to expression. And this is certainly a wonderful one of them. Yeah, the lyrics, I mean, it has just a lot of quite profound lyrics. I mean, it even has some nice nuances on natural theology, in a sense, where it's not doing theology in a natural theology kind of way where it's using it. It's simply acknowledging that these things, you know, field and fountain, they're not all coming up from me right now. Anyway, but they're all just pointing to him. And that's, I mean, that's a T.F. Torrance kind of thing, that they don't speak in such a way that we form a theology, but they all point us to and remind us to the one who is the creator. And if you ever went on a hike with J.B. Torrance, which I did several times, he delighted in the beauty of creation. There was no sense in which it was a natural theology. He knew the creator and was just enamored with the beauty of all that was created. And so it's a tragedy that people think of the Torrance Barth traditions as being anti-nature, because that is clearly not the case. If you've ever been to Switzerland too, Barth regularly went up into the Swiss Alps and enjoyed the beauty of all that was there. It was, you know, a regular part of the rhythm of his year. So anyway, that song, as I was, I saw that same video this morning. That was why I was able to pull it up as an illustration.
You did?
Yeah. So you were experiencing at another point in the timeline of today of the same thing, which there is that heuristic discovery where things come up and invite us into, you know, the sharing of something that's meaningful. And because I had seen it and was able to bring it, it triggered what had been an experience for you. And
Yeah,
that's something of what the community does. It just keeps bringing to life, I think, those things that are reminders and invitations into the heuristic discovery of the beauty and the grandeur of God as it shows up in our contexts.
it was the kid that shinnied up the lamppost and was leading the orchestra up there. A little kid.
Yeah.
It was beautiful.
It
And
was.
all of the kids. Yeah. I posted that. I shared that on my Facebook feed.
And somehow the nature of the gospel properly done should have children delighting in what it is that we're doing and saying and being. I mean,
I was thinking about that. Yeah.
there is a sense of true echoes unless you become like little children.
The whole idea, as I understand it from what I read, was Beethoven. I mean, the whole thing speaks to bringing people together, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Bringing peace. Peace is what it among mankind.
Yeah.
The
angels did say something about that. Peace on earth, goodwill toward man.
That's beautiful. I must have looked at it 4 or 5 times and showed it to my wife, shared it with my wife.
Wonderful. On Tuesday, I went to a movie called I Heard the Bells, which is the story of Wadsworth writing the hymn, I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day, in the midst of the Civil War. And just the anguish that he felt with what was going on. And those lines, you know, I bowed my head, there is no peace on earth, I said, because that was what he saw around him. But then ultimately, to hear the bells and to recognize God is not dead. It was quite a touching movie.
The audible light, as Torrance
Yeah.
says, the
Yeah.
audible light of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, yeah,
We hear the word.
yeah,
Word is the light that's come into the world.
yeah.
Wow, that's
Torrance spoke a lot about the audible, didn't he, rather than the visual. So
Yes, he did,
hearing
for
rather
very good
than-
reasons. It goes
Yeah.
back to John McMurray again.
Hmm.
John McMurray assesses that the Greek and Roman cultures predominantly observed the world, observation, and seeing was believing. So our Western Greco-Roman culture has based science on the observation of the world. The Hebrew culture, John McMurray said, the very foundation of who they were is those who heard the word of God. Hear, O Israel. And so McMurray, and from him, Torrance argues that in hearing, we're at a completely different key in a sense. We're in the realm of the personal. And that the whole nature of the culture that comes from it is one of personal interaction rather than impersonal observation, identification in impersonal kinds of ways. So to say that people like Buber and Einstein and others who come from the Jewish tradition have given us ways of hearing that are more scientific than the theoretical, this is where his language comes from, that sits back and observes but doesn't really engage or indwell in a Polanyian kind of way, which Polanyi was also originally Jewish. So that there's something about the culture that allows you to engage the world in a different way in hearing that is much more personal and engaged rather than distancing, objective, impersonal, which John McMurray says we have a basic choice to see the world as personal or impersonal. If it's personal, then it is engaged in a way that cares, is all of Torrance's divine and contingent order. Everything makes sense within a personally involved way of being. Otherwise, it's all chance, it's all impersonal. There is no cause or reason for anything that really gives value or meaning to anything. So for McMurray, it is the first choice. Is the world personal universe, the personal universe, or is it impersonal? And he argues it is personal.
Yeah, I like that. That makes sense to me. I mean, you could say that you can't see God, but you can hear him in a sense.
Right. And hearing in the person of Jesus is the most clear. If you really want to know God, and then for Bart and Torrance, the science, what we call science, is really just it's an understanding of all that God has made. Science is understanding and giving voice to creation, and to live and to care for it, in a sense, as God's created work.
Is there any way that Torrance would say could be any validity in the concept of a quote book of nature? For instance, like Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, or the traditional, although this might not be the way your mentor Douglas Campbell would see it, but Romans 1:18 through 20, that what is unseen is evident through what we can see. Is there any way that Torrance could see that as not being foundationalist, where it's just starting with us sort of stair-stepping our way into knowledge of God, but God revealing to us, Christ himself revealing to us things, but through using nature, like the heavens declare? Is there any way that it would not be heretical to think there is something of a book of nature that Christ is using, so to speak?
So the lectures that I heard primarily on this have been J.B. Torrance. He says, once you say the book of nature, we become the interpreters. And so some of the interpretations in history that have been there is you are black and I am white. And I have the power and you do not. Therefore, God has made it this way. You are a woman, you are weaker than me. Therefore, God obviously has made me to rule over you. So once we become the interpreters of nature, the question, what is it that sets the limits on our abusive, basically drawing conclusions that serve us in the interpretation of the book of nature? And JB basically intimated that for Bart, there was nothing that wasn't susceptible to taking something and making it into something that was self-serving, which, a classic example of that is the theory of the Third Reich, that, we are the people who are the better people who are, by God's blessing, and they brought in the Christian church to serve their purposes. It was all building on an interpretation of the book of nature in the form of the folk, the people, and what it is that we are intended to do, and who we determine is, God's enemy, the Jews. So the question, once you open the door to a person or a group of persons being the interpreters of the book of nature, is there anything that will keep them from reading their own agenda into it? The classic phrase, "We live in God's country," is simply a statement. I find this place beautiful, and God must too. If God's got half a brain, he must think like me. And so God very quickly, in a sleight of hand move, this is my chapter in Face to Face Volume 3, Sleight of Hand Theology, is to say all natural theology is a sleight of hand move that wants to say it's about God, but it slips in human agendas that ultimately further something that has little or nothing to do with God and a lot to do with people who are seeking power.
Okay, let me disinfect the question. Is there any way that the heavens declare the glory of God when we're out and hiking at midnight and in awe of the stars or whatever?
Yeah. So that's a different question. There is, if you look at Psalm 19, it's day after day they pour forth speech, night after night they display knowledge. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the earth. So there's something going out, and the words speech and language are being used. But there's a sense in which they don't articulate the nature of what it goes on to talk about the law of the Lord, which is perfect and revives the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. So there is the inarticulate, what I would call the art of God, which one can say, thanks be to the God who creates sunsets and mountains. He also creates tornadoes and deserts and other things. He's created a world that has all these dimensions. So I can't select just the things that favor me. I have to recognize that God, the Lord God, made them all. And so whenever I start selecting, then I'm taking the place of God in being the judge. And so if I'm going to actually know God, then we do theology proper. Where has God given God's self to be known? That is in the person of Christ. Where do we hear the voice of Christ? We hear it in Scripture. So the nature of nature being something that we come and see that Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, and in the beginning was the Word, and all things have come into being through him, then I can look and say, good job. What you have made, as I sit here, is beautiful. I honor you as the creator. I give glory to you as the one who maintains, sustains all things. But we're not trying to know God through the creation. We are acknowledging who the creator is, and that for us in this place, it is touching me.
Yes. So, okay. So here's it. Would it be heretical to say that it's the nature of nature, as Christ is helping us know anything that we know? It's the nature of nature to point beyond itself, and specifically to God, although that may be a very inarticulate knowledge of God. Is it possible? Like, I think it's interesting. Okay, here's kind of the way I've been thinking for years, and tell me if this is heretical. I see it's about the first 6 verses or so of Psalm 19. It uses the word El for God, which is the most non-specific. I mean, it's even used for non-God gods in the Old Testament, and it can be interpreted big strength. It means very little, in terms of our knowledge of the triune Yahweh, and but then it gets to, as you mentioned, the law of the Lord is perfect. The statutes of the Lord are pure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when it goes into that, the Lord is saying Yahweh, the personal God of Israel. And so the way I've seen it is maybe Christ is speaking to people through nature in a rather, at least, pre-evangelistic manner, if you will. But that's about it. And but then it gets to other means of his revelation through scripture and other means of revelation where we learn more about God by his grace. Anyway, but I still tend to think there is some knowledge of God that is mediated into human beings through God. It's not just them. I'm not saying it's them separate from God through some sort of natural theology, stair-step bootstrapping their epistemic way into knowledge of God somehow. I'm saying that he is revealing himself, but maybe not that much. But are there problems with that, what I'm saying?
It would be nice if it was all that clean. J.V. Torrance would say, here I am in the state of Washington, and I went into your forest, and here was this sign from the Department of Natural Resources, land of many uses, was their subtext. He says, I want them to maintain this and respect the dignity of the land. They're just looking for how many ways they can use it for their ends. And he says, that is generally what I find people do with God's creation, is they look away to build something on the beach for their ends, or it's the nature of how we use creation is generally to serve our ends. So we'd like it all to be God honoring. The other side of what you're saying, though, I'm going through the book with a reading group, The Reasons for God by Tim Keller. And rather than talking about proofs for God, he talks about clues for God, right? And so he's saying for somebody who just says, prove to me God, he says, we can't prove that proofs for God are trustworthy. We can't prove that proving is a trustworthy thing to do. But we can ask about clues for the nature of things. And so he discusses, some things like the fine-tuned universe, that if things were just slightly different, we wouldn't exist. And the nature of DNA as an information system, the fact that it is there's an information system. We hear so much about the adaptation and selection of the evolutionary process, but it's all working within a system of information that is organized, that there isn't really reasoning why it come into being. So to say none of that speaks to us of the nature of God, maybe other than saying that, once you have come to know God, you'd say, that looks like a clue that I hadn't seen before about the nature of the world that God creates. Now I can understand DNA, genes as part of what it is that he has done. But to have somebody believe that God, particularly the Christian God, is what is referred to by DNA, that's a further stretch. But can it be a clue just to remove this sense there can't be a God, there's no evidence that there is a God, to say, well, there might be clues, right? But you're not building any theology off of that. And again, he does say, in the Christian view, the ultimate evidence for the existence of God is Jesus Christ himself. And I'd say beyond existence is even to say anything accurate about God. It's God who makes that. If there is a God, we are characters in his play. and have hope that he put information about himself in the play. And that's his understanding of the Bible and the person of Jesus, is that he put himself in the play and then he wrote the play, i.e. had the Bible. Christians believe he did more than just give us information. He wrote himself into the play as the main character in the story. When Jesus was born in a manger and rose from the dead, he is the one with whom we have to do. So the question of all of the clues and the nature of creation, to what degree does it get people to really get to the main character in the story, that's part of the concern. And there are people who certainly love creation, but they want nothing to do with the person of Christ. And so good on them for loving creation, for enjoying hiking and skiing and all those things that mountains might bring. But if we are functioning as theologians who want to bring people to a knowledge of the Creator, who has stepped into history, who invites people into a life that is transformed to be lived from love, and to share in God's love for the world, those other pieces may get in the way. And so the beginning of Romans question that Douglas Campbell speaks about, the whole nature of all of this is evidence, but the point in chapter 3, but nobody got it. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. It was there for everybody, but nobody got it. How do we get eyes to see the nature of the created world? We come to know the God in the person of Jesus, who gives us the eyes to see what was already there, but we didn't have eyes to see it. So there's an ordering of it. And this is, I think, where T.F. Torrance will go, which the first book that I'll do in January of the 12 books that T.F. Torrance edited, he wrote the first one, called Reality and Scientific Theology. And the chapters include Chapter 1, Classical and Modern Attitudes of Mind. Chapter 2, The Status of Natural Theology. See, right up front in discussing the boundaries of theology and science, he has to deal with natural theology. Chapter 3, The Science of God. Chapter 4, The Social Coefficients of Knowledge. Now it's the whole knowing in community, which Polanyi is so big on. The stratification of truth, the whole heuristic. Stratification is about the heuristic involvement in the different layers of knowledge that we enter into. And then finally, the Trinitarian structure of theology. So again, the nature of what Torrance is going to do in his first book in a series of 12 books is going to engage natural theology to, I think, take on some of your questions. From my understanding, which I haven't read all this book yet, is that he wants to do what I would call a theology of nature rather than natural theology. Once you have theology, now you have the eyes to see nature and to affirm it as God created, God sustained, the ordering of the world, and to say it is a theology of nature. And so it's a little bit tricky using the word natural theology, because that appears as though nature is your lens. But to say Torrance wants to affirm the world as that which God has made, and that science works with theology in understanding, caring for, and all that of a world that God has created and gives us as a gift as humans to live within, enjoy, and all that. Ray Anderson wrote a chapter in a book called A Theology of Nature, where he argued that as well. And he was, of course, a student of T.F. Torrance, so I think he was following up on those intuitions. Okay, well, I think we have done well. We've gone longer than we usually do, but the subjects are rich and deep. The people are of a high quality, so it's worth taking the time. Does anyone have any final thoughts before we head off? Next week we will have he's a professor in California who did his doctorate on T.F. Torrance and science. He is at a Seventh-day Adventist school in California. So there will be a link to his doctoral dissertation, which will attempt to survey at least the first chapter, get to know him a little bit. and investigate what he does with T.F. Torrance Theology and Science. So, blessings on you until next week. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
God
Thanks.
bless.
Good night.